May 12, 1945. 3 days after Victory in Europe Day, while celebrations continued across America, a moment of profound silence fell over the mess hall at Camp Shelby, Mississippi. 62 German women prisoners sat motionless before plates of food that made no sense to them. White, fluffy rounds of bread, if that's what they were, sat drowning in thick, pale sauce that looked nothing like any gravy they had ever seen. The smell was rich, savory, almost obscenely abundant. Steam rose from the plates in the cool morning air, carrying scents of butter, black pepper, and something else they couldn't identify. Pork, perhaps, but pork for prisoners? For enemies of America? 24-year-old Greta Schneider stared at her plate as if it might explode. Her hands remained folded in her lap, her back rigid with the military bearing that months of captivity had not erased. Beside her, 19-year-old Frida Vogel's eyes had filled with tears, though she made no sound. Down the long wooden table, 59 other German women sat in similar states of confusion and disbelief. They had been prisoners for 6 months. They had expected punishment, deprivation, perhaps even cruelty. They had been taught that Americans were ruthless, that capture meant suffering. Instead, they had been given 3 meals a day, real meals. And now this impossible breakfast that looked like something from before the war, from a world where food was plentiful and meals were celebrations rather than survival. Sergeant Willie Mae Johnson stood near the serving line, her dark hands resting on her hips as she observed the frozen Germans. She had been cooking in this camp since it opened, feeding American soldiers training for combat. Now she fed their former enemies with the same generous portions. She had prepared these biscuits herself that morning, rising at 4 o'clock to mix the dough, her grandmother's recipe committed to memory. The sausage gravy had simmered for an hour, seasoned exactly as her mama had taught her back in Alabama. She had made this breakfast not because regulations required it, but because she believed that hungry people deserved to eat well, regardless of which uniform they had worn. Captain Robert Mitchell watched from the doorway. He had been present for the arrival of these women 6 months earlier, had seen the fear and defiance in their eyes. He had read the intelligence reports about German propaganda, about what these women had been told to expect if captured by Americans. Torture, starvation, degradation. He had decided then that the best weapon against hatred was the simple act of proving it wrong. Lieutenant Sarah Brennan stood beside him, her expression softer but equally watchful. She had been the first person many of these women had spoken to upon arrival, the first American woman most of them had ever met. She had seen their shock at being treated with basic human dignity. But this morning felt different. This morning, something was breaking. The silence stretched. The biscuits cooled slightly, and still not one German woman had lifted her fork. November 18th, 1944. The transport truck rolled through the gates of Camp Shelby carrying cargo no one had prepared for. 62 German women, members of the Wehrmacht Auxiliary Corps, captured during the final Allied push through France. They wore remnants of gray uniforms, faces hollow from weeks of minimal rations during transport, eyes carrying the weight of defeat and uncertainty. The war was not yet over, but for them it had ended in a moment of capture that still felt unreal. Greta Schneider pressed her face close to the truck's canvas opening, catching glimpses of the American camp. Neat rows of buildings, soldiers moving with purpose, flags snapping in the Mississippi wind. She had joined the Radio Corps in 1942, believing she was defending the fatherland against barbaric enemies. Now she was about to become a prisoner of those same enemies, and every propaganda film she had ever seen played through her mind. Americans were supposed to be cruel, savage, driven by hatred of the German people. The truck stopped. Guards opened the back gate, and the women climbed down stiffly, their legs weak from the long journey. Lieutenant Sarah Brennan stood waiting, her crisp uniform and calm expression a stark contrast to what they had expected. She spoke in clear English, which Greta understood from her school years. "Welcome to Camp Shelby. You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention. You will be given housing, food, and medical care. You will be expected to follow camp regulations and treat staff with respect." Frida Vogel, standing near Greta, whispered in German, "It's a trick. They're lying to make us compliant before the real punishment begins." Others murmured agreement. They had been taught that American kindness was a facade, that behind the smiles lay brutality, worse than anything they could imagine. Liesel Hoffmann, a nurse's aide from Munich, clutched her small bag of possessions tighter. She had seen wounded German soldiers who had been prisoners of the Russians. She expected something similar here, perhaps slightly less barbaric, but painful nonetheless. The women were led to their barracks, a simple wooden structure with rows of cots, clean blankets folded at the foot of each bed. Windows let in afternoon light. A small stove sat in the corner for warmth. It was sparse, but it was clean. Greta Klein, 28 and the oldest among them, walked slowly between the cots, touching each blanket as if testing whether it was real. "This is better than what we had in the auxiliary barracks in France," she said quietly. The others didn't respond. Better conditions meant nothing if they were prelude to worse treatment later. That first evening, they were served dinner in the mess hall. Soup with vegetables and meat, bread with butter, weak coffee, real food, portions that filled their bowls. The women ate in silence, waiting for the other shoe to drop, for someone to reveal that this mercy was temporary. But no revelation came, only food and the unsettling possibility that they had been wrong about everything. The first week at Camp Shelby passed in a haze of confusion and suspicion. The German women moved through daily routines like sleepwalkers, unable to reconcile what they were experiencing with what they had been taught to expect. Every morning, Greta woke expecting to find that the reasonable treatment had been a dream, that today would bring the punishment they deserved as enemies of America. Instead, each day brought more of the same bewildering kindness. Meals appeared 3 times daily. Guards spoke to them with professional courtesy rather than hatred. No one struck them, no one starved them, no one seemed interested in revenge. During their time in the Wehrmacht Auxiliary Corps, they had attended mandatory viewings of propaganda films. Greta remembered them vividly. Americans portrayed as wealthy oppressors, interested only in destroying German culture and enslaving the German people. Jews and communists controlling American policy, turning the nation into a tool of anti-German hatred. American soldiers depicted as undisciplined savages who showed no mercy to prisoners. The films had shown American camps as places of systematic cruelty, where German prisoners were worked to death or simply murdered for entertainment. Every woman in the barracks carried these images in her mind, and every day at Camp Shelby contradicted them completely. Liesel found the dissonance almost physically painful. She had believed so completely in what she had been told. Her father had been a loyal party member. Her brothers had served on the Eastern Front. She had volunteered for the Auxiliary Corps because she genuinely believed Germany was fighting for its survival against enemies who wanted to erase German civilization from the earth. Now she sat in an American prison camp, adequately fed, adequately housed, treated with basic human dignity by people who were supposed to hate her. Either everything she had believed was a lie, or this temporary mercy was an elaborate deception before something worse. Frida, the youngest, struggled most visibly with the contradiction. She had been only 15 when the war began, her entire adolescence shaped by Nazi education and propaganda. She knew no other framework for understanding the world. When Private Tommy Hayes, a young Georgian guard, offered her an extra blanket during a cold night, she had recoiled, as if he had offered poison. He had looked hurt by her reaction, which made no sense. Why would an American soldier care about the comfort of a German prisoner? Why would he feel hurt by her rejection? The propaganda had never explained that Americans might see them as human beings worthy of basic consideration. Greta, older and more observant, began to notice small details that didn't fit the narrative they had been given. The American soldiers were not wealthy oppressors living in luxury while prisoners starved. They ate the same food, lived in similar barracks, complained about the same military regulations. Many of them seemed as young and uncertain as the German prisoners, farm boys and city workers who had been drafted into service and were trying to make sense of their own circumstances. Greta's stomach had not felt truly full since 1943. That was when rationing in Germany had become severe enough that even those with connections felt the constant gnaw of insufficient food. As a radio operator stationed in France, she had received military rations that were supposed to be adequate, but even those had diminished as Allied bombing disrupted supply lines. Breakfast had become ersatz coffee and a slice of dark bread. Lunch might be thin soup with a few vegetables. Dinner was often just potatoes and more bread. Real meat had become a memory. Butter was a luxury. Sugar existed only in rumors. But that was luxury compared to what civilians were experiencing back home. Letters from her mother in Berlin had grown increasingly desperate through 1944. "We stand in line for hours for a single loaf of bread," her mother had written in July. "The ration cards mean nothing when there is nothing to ration. Frau Drescher's daughter collapsed from hunger last week. The doctors can do nothing. There is simply no food." Greta had read those letters in her barracks in France, feeling helpless and guilty that she had access to military rations while her family starved. Liesel's memories of hunger were more recent and more traumatic. When her field hospital had been overrun by Allied forces in September, she and the other medical staff had not eaten for 3 days during the chaos of retreat and capture. She remembered the hollow feeling that went beyond mere hunger into something that felt like her body consuming itself, the weakness that made simple movements difficult, the way her hands had trembled when she tried to perform even basic tasks. The transport to America had provided minimal rations, enough to prevent death, but not enough to restore any sense of normalcy. Frida had grown up hungry. She had been 11 when the war began, and her teenage years had been shaped entirely by scarcity. She could barely remember what it felt like to eat until satisfied, rather than eating until the food ran out. Her mother had worked in a munitions factory, and most of her calories had gone to supporting that essential war work, leaving little for Frida and her younger siblings. Frida had learned to ignore her body's hunger signals, to accept the constant emptiness as normal, to feel grateful for whatever small portions appeared. Now, sitting in an American prison camp, they were being fed 3 times a day. Real food in quantities that seemed almost obscene compared to what they had known. The first few days, their shrunken stomachs could not handle the portions. Several women had become ill from eating too quickly, their bodies unaccustomed to adequate nutrition. Sergeant Johnson had noticed and had begun serving smaller initial portions, gradually increasing amounts as their systems adjusted. This attention to their physical needs had been more unsettling than anything else. Why would their captors care whether they ate too quickly? Why would an American cook show concern for German digestive systems? May 12th began like any other morning at Camp Shelby. The German women rose at 6 o'clock, made their beds with military precision, and filed toward the mess hall in quiet columns. 6 months of routine had made the process automatic. They no longer flinched when American guards greeted them. They no longer expected each meal to be their last before punishment began. But they had not yet relaxed into anything resembling comfort. They remained prisoners, and prisoners learned to expect nothing beyond basic survival. Sergeant Willie Mae Johnson had arrived at the kitchen at 4 o'clock that morning with a specific purpose. The war in Europe was over. These women would eventually return to whatever remained of their homeland. But this morning, she wanted to give them something to remember, something that might challenge whatever hatred still lived in their hearts. She had grown up in rural Alabama, the granddaughter of people who had been enslaved, the daughter of sharecroppers who had known hunger as intimate as any enemy. She understood what it meant to be seen as less than human. She had experienced American racism in forms both casual and violent. Yet she had also learned from her grandmother that the highest form of resistance to hatred was radical kindness, that feeding people well was a form of dignity that transcended politics and war. Her hands worked the biscuit dough with practiced efficiency, folding and pressing until the texture was perfect. She had made thousands of biscuits in her lifetime, but these felt different. These were not just food, these were a statement, a declaration that even enemies deserve to eat well, that abundance shared was more powerful than abundance hoarded. The sausage gravy simmered on the stove, rich with fat and seasoning, thick enough to coat the back of a spoon. It was her grandmother's recipe passed down through generations, and she made it with the same care she would use for family. Captain Mitchell had approved her menu without question. He had learned to trust her judgment about food and its power to communicate what words could not. Lieutenant Brennan had helped set the tables that morning, placing the plates with unusual attention to detail. Even Private Hayes, usually assigned to perimeter duty, had volunteered to help serve. Something about the morning felt significant, though none of them could have articulated exactly why. When the German women entered the mess hall, they found their usual seats and waited for the meal service to begin. They expected oatmeal, perhaps, or bread with jam, something simple and sufficient. Instead, Sergeant Johnson and her team emerged from the kitchen, carrying platters of golden biscuits split open and swimming in creamy white gravy. The smell hit the Germans first. Butter, pepper, sage, pork fat, rich and overwhelming. Plates were set before each woman with careful attention. Large portions, generous servings, the kind of breakfast that spoke of abundance rather than rationing. And then the Americans stepped back and waited to see what would happen next. Greta stared at her plate, trying to categorize what she was seeing. The round golden objects looked somewhat like bread rolls, but lighter, fluffier, with layers visible where they had been split open. The sauce covering them was unlike any gravy she knew. German gravy was brown, made from meat drippings, thin and flavorful, but never thick like this. This white sauce looked almost like a cream soup, but heavier, with visible black pepper flecks and what appeared to be crumbled meat suspended throughout. The combination made no culinary sense to her German understanding of proper food. Beside her, Liesel leaned forward slightly, inhaling the steam rising from her plate. "Is this safe to eat?" she whispered in German. It was not an idle question. The richness of the smell alone suggested a fat content that their depleted bodies might not handle well. They had learned through painful experience during their first weeks at camp that American portions could overwhelm digestive systems accustomed to starvation rations. Several women had become violently ill from eating too quickly or consuming foods too rich for their condition. Frida picked up her fork but did not move it toward the food. "My mother told me Americans eat strangely," she said softly. "She said they have no culture, no proper cuisine, just excess and waste." The words sounded hollow even as she spoke them. 6 months of adequate American meals had already begun eroding that particular piece of propaganda. The food they had been served at Camp Shelby was simple but well prepared, seasoned properly, served in quantities that suggested care rather than contempt. Greta Klein, always the most analytical of the group, studied the sauce more carefully. "It looks like a bechamel," she said, "but with meat added. And these bread things, they are similar to scones perhaps, but lighter. American baking uses different techniques than ours." She had worked in administrative kitchens in Hamburg before the war, had some understanding of cooking beyond what most soldiers possessed. "This is not random food. Someone made this with skill and intention." Margaret Hoffman, who had been silent until now, spoke barely above a whisper. "Why would they do this? We are prisoners. We are enemies. Why would they give us food that clearly required effort and expense?" Dibbit was the question they were all thinking but had been afraid to articulate. The breakfast before them was not punishment rations. It was not the minimum required by the Geneva Convention. It was something else entirely. something that felt almost like hospitality, which made no sense at all in the context of war and captivity. Down the table, other women were having similar whispered conversations in German. Some touched their forks to the white sauce tentatively, testing its texture. Others simply stared, paralyzed by confusion and the fear of what accepting this kindness might mean. If they ate this food, if they acknowledged its quality and generosity, what would that say about everything they had believed? What would it say about the side they had chosen? Sergeant Johnson watched the frozen Germans with patient understanding. She had seen this before, in different contexts, the paralysis that came when people encountered kindness they believed they did not deserve. She had felt it herself as a child when white shopkeepers in town had occasionally shown her small mercies that contradicted the racism she had learned to expect. The confusion of receiving humanity from people you had been taught to fear. She waited, letting them process what was before them, knowing that pushing would only deepen their suspicion. Captain Mitchell shifted his weight near the doorway. He had never seen the prisoners so completely still. Usually there was some movement, some quiet conversation, the sounds of eating, beginning, even if tentatively. This morning, nothing. Just 62 women staring at plates of food as if they contained riddles rather than breakfast. He wondered if he had miscalculated, if this gesture of abundance had been too much, too sudden. Perhaps gradual increases in meal quality would have been wiser than this dramatic presentation. It was Greta who finally moved first. She lifted her fork with deliberate slowness, cut a small piece of biscuit with the edge, and brought it to her mouth. The other women watched her as if she were testing for poison. She chewed slowly, her expression shifting through several emotions in rapid succession. Surprise at the texture, soft and buttery, in a way German military bread never was. Then recognition of the flavors, simple but perfectly balanced. Salt, butter, a hint of sweetness in the dough itself. She swallowed, then took a second bite, this time including some of the gravy. Her eyes closed involuntarily. The richness was almost overwhelming after months of adequate but plain food. The sausage gravy carried flavors that reminded her of her grandmother's kitchen in Hamburg before the war, when ingredients had been plentiful and meals had been celebrations rather than fuel. Cream, pork, sage, black pepper, all blended into something both foreign and somehow familiar. Comfort food, though she did not know that English term. Food that spoke of home and safety and abundance. When Greta opened her eyes, again tears were streaming down her face. She made no sound, but her shoulders shook slightly with emotion she could not name. Grief, perhaps, for the years of deprivation, relief at finally having enough, shame at accepting kindness from enemies, confusion about what any of this meant, all of it tangled together into tears she could not control or explain. She took another bite, then another, unable to stop now that she had started. Seeing Greta's reaction broke whatever spell had held the others frozen. Liesel began eating, then Frida, then Margaret. All down the long tables, German women lifted their forks and tasted American abundance for the first time, and one by one they began to cry. Not loud sobbing, but quiet tears that fell into their plates and mixed with the white gravy. Tears for everything they had lost, everything they had believed, everything they were discovering was more complicated than they had ever imagined. Private Tommy Hayes stood near the serving line, watching the German women weep into their breakfast, and felt something crack open in his own chest. He was 20 years old, from a small town in Georgia, where he had been taught that Germans were monsters who started wars and killed innocent people. He had enlisted, believing he would fight evil incarnate, that the enemy was something less than human. But these crying women looked exactly like his sister and her friends back home. Young, scared, overwhelmed by emotions they could not control. He had never expected enemies to look so painfully, obviously human. Greta wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, embarrassed by her tears, but unable to stop them. She took another bite of biscuit, forcing herself to chew slowly despite the urge to devour everything on her plate. The food was not just filling her stomach, it was filling some deeper emptiness she had not known existed. 6 months of adequate rations had kept her alive, but this breakfast was something else. This was abundance. This was care. This was someone deciding that German prisoners deserved to eat food that required effort and skill and expense to prepare. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. Liesel found herself thinking about the propaganda film she had watched in training. Americans portrayed as culturally inferior, as people without sophistication or refinement, interested only in material excess and violence. Yet this breakfast demonstrated a culinary tradition she had not known existed. Someone's grandmother had perfected this recipe. Someone had taught the cook these techniques. Someone had decided that good food mattered enough to do it properly, even for prisoners, even for enemies. That kind of care suggested a depth of culture the propaganda had insisted Americans did not possess. Frida ate mechanically, each bite making her feel more confused and more ashamed. If Americans could be this kind, what did that say about the cause she had believed in? What did it say about the war? Her brothers had died fighting? If the enemy was capable of this level of humanity, had Germany been wrong about everything? The questions felt dangerous, like thinking them might make her a traitor to her country, to her family, to the memory of everyone who had sacrificed for the Reich. But the questions would not stop coming, and each bite of rich American gravy made them louder. Sergeant Johnson finally spoke, her voice carrying across the silent mess hall. "There's more if anyone wants seconds," she said simply. The statement landed like a bomb. Seconds. More food. Not rationing, not measuring, not counting every calorie to ensure minimum survival. Just more freely offered, as if food was something to be shared rather than hoarded. Several women looked up at her with expressions that mixed gratitude and something close to anguish. How were they supposed to hate people who kept proving themselves worthy of respect? How were they supposed to maintain their identity as loyal Germans, when their supposed enemies kept demonstrating more humanity than their own propaganda had ever acknowledged in itself? Sergeant Willie Mae Johnson returned to the kitchen, leaving the German women to their emotional breakfast, and began preparing the next round of biscuits. She had expected some reaction, but not tears. Not that particular kind of quiet grief that came from having your understanding of the world fundamentally challenged. She knew that feeling intimately. She had felt it herself at 12 years old when a white teacher had shown her unexpected kindness despite Alabama's rigid racial codes. The confusion of receiving humanity from someone you had been taught to fear or hate. The way it forced you to question everything. She had grown up in Montgomery, the granddaughter of enslaved people, the daughter of sharecroppers who had worked white men's land for barely enough to survive. She had learned early that America was not the land of freedom its propaganda claimed. She had experienced segregation in its cruelest forms, separate water fountains, separate schools, separate doors for entering buildings. She had been called names she would not repeat. She had seen her father humiliated by white men who believed his skin color made him less than human. She understood what it meant to be considered an enemy in your own country. Yet she had also learned something else from her grandmother, a woman who had been born into slavery and had survived emancipation into a world barely better than bondage. Her grandmother had taught her that hatred was a poison that hurt the person carrying it more than the person it was aimed at. That the way to resist dehumanization was to refuse to dehumanize others, even those who deserved it. That feeding people well was a form of power that transcended politics and prejudice. "You can't hate someone whose food is in your belly," her grandmother had said. Not really, not in the deep way that lasts. So, when Willie Mae had been assigned to cook for German prisoners, she had seen an opportunity, not for revenge, though. God knew she had reasons to be angry at white people, and these German women were as white as they came. But for something more powerful than revenge. for proof that humanity could transcend ideology, that someone who had every reason to be bitter could choose kindness instead, that the daughter of sharecroppers could show more grace than the daughters of the so-called master race. She mixed more dough, her hands moving with the muscle memory of decades. Her enlistment had been one of the few paths available to a black woman in Alabama who wanted something beyond domestic service or field work. The Army was segregated, of course. She served in a colored unit, cooked for colored soldiers most of the time, but her skills had earned her enough respect that when the camp needed someone to manage the prisoner kitchen, they had chosen her despite her race. Some white soldiers grumbled about taking orders from a black woman, but they ate her food and kept their complaints quiet. She thought about those German women crying over biscuits and gravy, confronting the possibility that they had been wrong about Americans. The sound of scraping forks against plates filled the mess hall, a rhythm both familiar and strange. Usually the German women ate quickly and efficiently, military training overriding everything else. This morning they ate slowly, as if each bite required careful consideration. Some women had stopped crying, others wept quietly throughout the entire meal. A few sat motionless, having finished their plates but unable to process what had just happened. Private Hayes approached the nearest table, carrying a pitcher of coffee. "More coffee?" he asked, his Georgia accent making the words soft and almost apologetic. Greta looked up at him, her eyes red from crying, and nodded. He filled her cup and she wrapped both hands around it, seeking warmth and something to anchor herself. "Thank you," she said in careful English. The words felt inadequate. "How did you thank someone for shattering your understanding of reality? How did you express gratitude for kindness that made you question everything you had believed about yourself and your country?" Hayes smiled slightly, awkward in the face of her emotion, and moved to the next woman. Liesl found herself standing, her empty plate in hand, walking toward the serving line before she had consciously decided to move. Sergeant Johnson looked up from the kitchen window as Liesl approached. "More?" the sergeant asked, and Liesl nodded, unable to speak. Johnson placed 2 more biscuits on her plate and ladled gravy over them with the same generous portion she had served the first time. "Eat slow," she said gently. "Your stomach needs time to adjust." Liesl carried her plate back to the table, aware that other women were watching her, waiting to see if seconds were truly allowed or if this was some kind of test. When no punishment came, others began standing. A small line formed at the serving window. Frida was among them, her hands shaking as she held out her plate. She had never been allowed seconds of anything in her entire life. Even before the war, before rationing became severe, her family had been poor enough that extra portions were impossible luxuries. Now, an American sergeant, a black woman who should have been her enemy twice over, was giving her more food than she could possibly eat. The absurdity of it made her want to laugh and cry simultaneously. Margaret watched the line of German women returning to their seats with full plates and felt something fundamental shift inside her. This was not the minimum required by the Geneva Convention. This was not enemies being kept barely alive until they could be returned to their own country. This was something that looked almost like care, like someone had decided they deserved to be fed well, to experience abundance, to be treated as people worthy of consideration. She thought about her brothers fighting on the Eastern Front, about the stories they had written home about Russian prisoners starved and worked to death, about what German camps had done to their enemies. And here she sat, a German prisoner being offered seconds. Greta lay in her bunk that night, unable to sleep despite physical exhaustion. Her stomach was fuller than it had been in years, uncomfortably so. She had eaten 3 servings of biscuits and gravy that morning, unable to stop herself even when her body protested. Now she paid the price with digestive discomfort, but that physical pain was nothing compared to the emotional turmoil churning through her mind. She kept thinking about her mother's letters from Berlin. "We are starving," her mother had written in March. "Please, if you have any food, send it home." Greta had been a prisoner then, unable to send anything, but fed adequately enough that she had not experienced true hunger herself. Now she had eaten American abundance, while her mother likely scraped by on ration cards that bought less each week. The guilt was crushing. How could she accept seconds, thirds, generous portions of rich food, while her family starved in the ruins of Berlin? What kind of daughter ate well while her mother went hungry? What kind of German found comfort in enemy kindness while her countrymen suffered? The questions circled endlessly, offering no resolution, only deeper layers of shame and confusion. Liesel stared at the ceiling, her hands folded across her stomach. She was thinking about the wounded German soldiers she had treated in France, men with infected wounds, with limbs that had to be amputated using inadequate anesthesia, with fevers that raged unchecked because there were no medicines left. She had held their hands while they died, had written letters to their families explaining that their sons and husbands had died bravely for the fatherland. She had believed those letters. She had believed the sacrifice was noble and necessary. But if Americans were capable of feeding their enemies this well, what did that say about German treatment of prisoners? About the choices her country had made? Frida was crying again, quietly, her face pressed into her pillow to muffle the sound. She felt like a traitor. She had enjoyed that breakfast, more than enjoyed it. She had felt grateful. She had looked at Sergeant Johnson and felt genuine thankfulness toward a black American woman, toward someone who represented everything the Reich had taught her to despise. She had been raised to believe in racial purity, in German superiority, in the righteousness of the Nazi cause. Yet this morning, she had received more kindness from a black American than she had ever received from her own officers. Greta Klein did sleep, but her dreams were troubled. She saw her grandmother's kitchen in Hamburg, the way it had been before the war. Smells of baking bread, roasting meat, real coffee. Her grandmother teaching her to cook, explaining that food was how you showed love, how you built family, how you created home. Then the dream shifted, and she was in the Camp Shelby mess hall, watching Sergeant Johnson serve gravy with the same careful attention her grandmother had shown, the same understanding that food meant more than nutrition. The transition between the two women blurred, and Greta woke confused about which kitchen was real, which kindness could be trusted, which home she actually belonged to anymore. Greta sat in the barracks common room the next morning, a piece of paper before her and a pen in her hand. The International Red Cross allowed prisoners to send limited correspondence home, but every letter was censored and certain topics were forbidden. She could not write about camp conditions in detail. She could not describe the kindness she was experiencing. She could not explain how American treatment was systematically dismantling everything she had been taught to believe. Instead, she wrote careful, neutral sentences. I am healthy. I am being treated adequately according to international law. I hope you are safe. I think of you always. The words felt like lies of omission. What she wanted to write was something else entirely. Dear Mother, yesterday the Americans served us a breakfast so abundant, I wept. They gave us seconds and thirds without hesitation, as if feeding enemies well was natural rather than extraordinary. A black woman sergeant cooked for us with skill that matched grandmother's, and I realized we were taught wrong about everything. I don't know who I am anymore or what I believed in. I don't know how to come home to you when home is built on lies I can no longer accept. But those words would never pass the censors, and even if they could, what would they do to her mother? How could she burden her starving family with her crisis of conscience? Liesel wrote to her sister in Munich, if her sister was still alive. She had not heard from her family since October. I hope this letter finds you well. I am healthy and safe. The war in Europe is over now. I hope that means you have peace finally. I will come home as soon as I am allowed. What she wanted to write was, I am ashamed. I am confused. I ate food yesterday that made me question everything Father taught us. I looked into the face of an American private and saw someone exactly like our brother Hans. I don't know how to be German anymore. I don't know how to face you when I come home, knowing what I know now, feeling what I feel. Frida did not write at all. Her family had been bombed out of Dresden in February. She had received a Red Cross notification weeks ago confirming that her mother and siblings were dead. There was no one left to write to, no one waiting for her return. The realization made her both freer and more lost than the other women. She had no family loyalty to betray with her changing perspective, but she also had no anchor, no reason to return to Germany at all. She was 19 years old with no home, no family, and an emerging understanding that everything she had been taught was propaganda designed to make her complicit in atrocities she had not understood she was supporting. Margaret wrote methodically to her husband, who was presumably in a prisoner of war camp somewhere himself, if he had survived. Captain Mitchell called a mandatory assembly in the camp's main hall 3 days after the biscuits and gravy breakfast. The German women filed in with their usual order, but something had shifted in their bearing. They no longer held themselves with the rigid defensive posture that had characterized their first months at Camp Shelby. Lieutenant Brennan noticed it immediately. They looked tired, emotionally wrung out, but also somehow more present than before, more engaged with the reality around them, rather than the ideology inside their heads. The captain stood before them with several newspapers spread on the table beside him. American papers, British papers, even some German-language publications that had been printed by Allied forces in occupied Germany. "Ladies," he began in English, with Lieutenant Brennan translating into German, "I want to show you something. I want you to see what your country did, what you were part of, whether you knew it or not." He held up the first newspaper. The images were grainy but clear enough. Bergen-Belsen, piles of emaciated bodies, skeletal survivors staring at cameras with hollow eyes, American and British soldiers, their faces showing shock and horror at what they had discovered. Greta felt her stomach twist. She had heard rumors, whispers among prisoners about camps that were not prisoner of war facilities, but something else, something darker. But seeing the photographs made it real in a way that rumors never could. These were not enemy propaganda pictures designed to make Germany look bad. These were documentation, evidence, proof of systematic atrocity that no amount of denial could erase. She heard Liesel make a small sound beside her, something between a gasp and a sob. Captain Mitchell continued, showing more images. Dachau, Buchenwald, Auschwitz, each camp worse than the last. Each photograph documenting horrors that seemed impossible but were undeniably real. "These camps existed in your country," he said, his voice steady but carrying an edge of controlled anger. "While you were serving in your auxiliary corps, while you were believing you were defending the fatherland, these places operated with the full knowledge and support of your government. Millions of people murdered, Jews, Roma, political prisoners, disabled people, homosexuals, anyone the Reich deemed unworthy of life." Frida was shaking, her hands gripped together so tightly her knuckles had gone white. She thought about the propaganda she had absorbed in school, in the Hitler Youth, in every aspect of her education. Jews, portrayed as dangerous enemies of German prosperity. Other groups characterized as drains on national resources. She had believed it, or at least she had never questioned it deeply enough to doubt. She had accepted that some people needed to be removed from society for the greater good, but this systematic murder of millions? This was not removal. This was extermination. This was the logical conclusion of the ideology she had embraced without understanding where it would lead. The meals at Camp Shelby continued, but they had taken on new meaning after the assembly, where Captain Mitchell had shown the concentration camp photographs. Every breakfast, every lunch, every dinner became an implicit lesson in the contrast between American treatment of prisoners and German treatment of those it had deemed enemies. Sergeant Johnson still cooked with the same care and skill, but now the German women understood what her kindness actually meant. It was not just feeding, it was a demonstration of fundamental difference in values, a statement that even enemies deserve to eat well, to be treated with basic human dignity, to be seen as people rather than problems to be eliminated. Greta found herself watching Johnson in the kitchen whenever she could. The sergeant's movements were efficient but never rushed, careful but never fussy. She treated food preparation with a seriousness that suggested it was more than just a job. One morning, when Greta was on kitchen duty helping to clean dishes, she worked up the courage to speak. "Sergeant Johnson," she said in her accented English, "may I ask you a question?" Johnson looked up from the pot she was stirring. "Go ahead." Greta hesitated, then pushed forward. "Why do you cook so well for us? We are your enemies. We are German. You could give us minimum rations and follow regulations. Why do you do more?" Johnson was quiet for a moment, still stirring. Then she said, "My grandmother was born a slave. You know what that, means?" Greta nodded. "She taught me that you don't become a good person by treating good people well. That's easy. You become a good person by treating everyone well, even people who don't deserve it, even people who would treat you badly if positions were reversed. She said that's how you prove you're better than hate. You refuse to act like it, even when you got reason to." She looked directly at Greta. "I got plenty of reasons to be angry at white people, your people included. But I'm not going to become what I hate. I'm going to cook good food and treat people like they're human, because that's who I choose to be." The words hit Greta harder than any of Captain Mitchell's evidence had. This was not theoretical. This was not about documents and photographs. This was a woman who had experienced oppression, choosing to show mercy to people who represented a system that would have considered her inferior. A black woman in segregated America, cooking for members of the so-called master race, and doing it with grace and skill that put them all to shame. Greta felt tears coming again and blinked them back. "Thank you," she managed, "for teaching us this, for showing us what we should have been." Johnson nodded once and went back to her stirring. The conversation was over, but its impact rippled through Greta's understanding of everything. That evening, she translated what Johnson had said for the other women. They sat in the barracks in silence afterward, each processing the implications in her own way. June arrived with Mississippi heat that made the barracks uncomfortable and the mess hall almost unbearable during midday meals. But the weather was not what occupied the minds of the German women. Word had come through official channels that repatriation would begin within weeks. They would be processed, transported to ports, shipped across the Atlantic, and released into occupied Germany to find whatever remained of their former lives. The news should have brought relief, freedom, the end of captivity. Instead, it brought a deep and complicated dread that none of them wanted to acknowledge, but all of them felt. Greta lay awake at night thinking about Berlin. Her mother's last letter had arrived in April, written in March before communications had become even more disrupted. "The city is unrecognizable," her mother had written. "Rubble everywhere. No electricity, no water systems functioning. We live like animals in the basement of what used to be our building." That was before the final Soviet assault. That was before the complete collapse of the Reich. What would Berlin be like now? What would her mother be like if she had survived? How could Greta return to that devastation after months of adequate food, shelter, and the difficult gift of having her illusions destroyed? Liesel had received news through the Red Cross that her sister in Munich was alive but barely surviving. The city had been heavily bombed. Food was scarce. The occupation, authorities were struggling to prevent mass starvation. Her sister's letter, forwarded through official channels, had been desperate. "Come home as soon as you can. We need you. Mother is ill, and there is no medicine. Please, Liesel, come home." The guilt was crushing. Her sister needed her. Her family needed her. But the thought of returning to Munich, of living in ruins and scarcity after experiencing American abundance, filled her with a shame so deep she could barely name it. What kind of person dreaded going home to help her family? Frida faced a different calculation. She had no family waiting. Dresden was gone, bombed into rubble, and everyone she had loved was dead. She could return to Germany, but to what? To a country that had betrayed everything she thought it stood for? To a society that would need to reckon with its atrocities but might instead choose denial? She was 19 years old. Her entire adult identity had been shaped by Nazi ideology that she now understood was evil. Who was she supposed to be in post-war Germany? How did you rebuild yourself when the foundation you had been built on was revealed as poisonous? The women began having quiet conversations in the barracks after lights out, whispered discussions about whether they wanted to return at all, whether staying in America might be possible, though none of them knew how that could work legally. They were prisoners of war. They had no status beyond that. They could not simply decide to remain. But the desire was there, growing stronger as repatriation date approached. The desire to stay in a place that had shown them who they could become, rather than return to a place that reminded them of who they had been. Lieutenant Brennan called a private meeting with the German women in the camp's small library. It was evening, after dinner, and the room felt intimate despite its institutional furniture. She had spent months working with these prisoners, had watched them transform from defensive captives into something more complicated, women wrestling with conscience, with identity, with the question of what they owed to a country that had lied to them about everything fundamental. She knew what she was about to offer would be controversial, possibly career-ending if her superiors disagreed. But she also believed it was right. "Ladies," she began, speaking slowly so those with limited English could follow while Greta translated the complicated parts into German, "I have been communicating with authorities about your situation, about repatriation, and I have been given permission to offer some of you an alternative." The room went completely silent. Even breathing seemed to stop. The United States government is establishing a program for displaced persons, people who cannot safely return to their home countries or who have compelling reasons to remain in the United States. It is possible that some of you might qualify for this program. It would not be easy. You would need sponsors. You would need employment. You would need to demonstrate that you have rejected the ideology you once served. But it is possible. The words hung in the air like something fragile and dangerous. Possible. Not guaranteed. Not simple. But possible. Greta felt her heart racing. She looked around at the other women, seeing her own hope and fear reflected in their faces. To stay would mean admitting that Germany was no longer home, that America, despite being enemy territory, had become something more important, a place where transformation was possible, a place where they could become something other than what the Reich had made them. Liesel thought about her sister's letter, the desperate plea to come home and help. Could she really abandon her family when they needed her? But another voice in her mind asked a different question. What help could she provide in Munich? She had no medical supplies. She had no access to food beyond what was rationed. She could offer her presence, her labor, but would that be enough to justify returning to a place that reminded her of everything she now regretted? Or could she do more good by staying in America, by becoming an example of what reconciliation and transformation looked like? Frida did not hesitate. "I want to stay," she said in English, the words coming out rushed and desperate. "I have no family in Germany, nothing to return to. Please, I want to stay here." Brennan nodded slowly. "I understand, but you need to understand what you would be giving up. Your German citizenship, possibly permanently, any chance of reuniting with distant relatives, your language, your culture, everything familiar. This would be choosing exile, choosing to become American when America has not always been kind to Germans." Margaret spoke up, her voice shaking. "America has been kinder to us than Germany ever was. Even as prisoners, we have been treated better here than we treated our own people. I want to stay too. I want to learn how to be the kind of person who deserves this kindness." July 15, 1945. The mess hall at Camp Shelby had been decorated with unusual care. Small American flags on the tables, fresh flowers that Lieutenant Brennan had arranged herself. The smell of biscuits baking filled the morning air, but this time it was mixed with other scents. Scrambled eggs, bacon, hash browns, fresh fruit that must have cost considerable money to acquire. Sergeant Johnson had prepared what she called a proper Southern farewell breakfast, and she had recruited every available cook to help her execute it perfectly. This would be the last meal for 47 German women who had chosen repatriation. Their transport would leave at noon. 15 women had requested to remain under the Displaced Persons Program. The paperwork was still being processed, their futures still uncertain, but they had made their choice. They sat at separate tables this morning, not by regulation, but by the natural division that choice had created. Those returning to Germany wore expressions of resignation mixed with determination. Those staying looked guilty and hopeful in equal measure. The separation hurt everyone, but it was necessary. They were embarking on different journeys now, and pretending otherwise would be dishonest. Captain Mitchell stood to address the room before the meal began. Today marks the end of your time as prisoners of war. For those returning to Germany, you carry with you our hope that you will help build a better country than the one that brought us all to war. For those staying, you carry the responsibility of proving that transformation is possible, that former enemies can become Americans. He paused, visibly emotional. All of you have taught us something important, that people are not their governments, that individuals can change, that kindness is never wasted, even when given to enemies. Sergeant Johnson began serving, and as she placed plates before the German women, she made eye contact with each one. No words, just acknowledgement, recognition that this moment mattered, that what had happened in this mess hall over the past months had been more than just feeding prisoners. It had been a quiet revolution, a demonstration that the values America claimed to hold could actually be practiced, even in the context of war and hatred. The women ate slowly, savoring not just the food, but the complicated emotions it carried: gratitude and grief, hope and regret, the knowledge that this breakfast marked an ending and a beginning simultaneously. Greta, who had chosen to stay, found herself at a table with Liesel, who was returning to Munich. They had become close over the months, and the separation felt like losing family. "Will you write to me?" Liesel asked in German. "Will you tell me what America is like when you are no longer a prisoner, but a citizen?" Greta nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Yes. And you must tell me about Germany, about whether it can become something worth returning to someday." They held hands across the table, gripping tightly, knowing that letters could never fully bridge the distance that was opening between them. May 12, 1965. Greta Schneider Mitchell stood in her kitchen in Worcester, Massachusetts, teaching her teenage daughter Emily how to make biscuits and gravy. Her hands moved through the motions automatically now, 20 years of practice having made the process second nature. But this morning was special. This was the anniversary of the breakfast that had changed her life, and she wanted Emily to understand what these particular biscuits meant. Not just food, not just a recipe, but a lesson about humanity that transcended borders and wars and all the things that divided people. Emily watched her mother's hands work the dough, fascinated by the story she had heard many times but never tired of hearing again. "So, Grandma Johnson really cooked this for you when you were a prisoner?" she asked. Emily called Willie Mae Johnson Grandma, despite no blood relation, because the sergeant had become family in the years since the war. She had attended Greta's wedding to an American teacher named Robert Mitchell, no relation to the captain. She had been present when Emily was born. She had taught Greta not just how to cook, but how to live with grace despite painful history. Across the Atlantic in Munich, Liesel Weber Hoffmann sat in her own kitchen teaching her nursing students about nutrition and care. She had returned to Germany in 1945, had helped her family survive the difficult occupation years, had eventually completed her medical education, and become an instructor at the university hospital. She taught her students more than just medical procedures. She taught them about dignity, about treating every patient with respect regardless of their background, about how care itself could be a form of healing that transcended medicine. She never told them the full story of where she had learned these lessons, but it shaped everything she taught. Frida, who had stayed in America and eventually married an Army veteran named Daniel Murphy, worked as a translator for the State Department. She specialized in German-American relations, helping to build the bridges between former enemies that the Cold War made essential. She often thought about that breakfast of biscuits and gravy, about how it had been the first crack in the wall of ideology she had been raised behind. She worked now to create more of those cracks, to help people see past propaganda to the humanity underneath. Margaret had become a teacher in Boston, educating children about the dangers of following leaders who promised easy answers to complicated questions. She taught about the Holocaust, about what happened when ordinary people chose to obey rather than question. About how her own transformation had begun with a simple breakfast that forced her to see her captors as human beings. Her students loved her because she never pretended to be perfect. She told them honestly that she had been wrong, had believed terrible things, but that people could change if they were willing to do the hard work of confronting their own prejudices. Sergeant Willie Mae Johnson, now retired from the Army, still lived in Alabama, but visited Greta regularly. She had watched with pride as the German women she had fed as prisoners became American citizens who embodied the best of what America claimed to be.